Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the next speaker, Ben de Waal.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about something you've probably heard quite often, the myth of intrinsic value. So who here has actually heard Bitcoin has no intrinsic value? Yeah? You know what? Lots of people keep saying this. You know, Peter Schiff on Twitter, he says it a lot. It's written a lot. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Bitcoin seems to be relying on the greater fool theory. All you need to do is profit from an investment to find someone willing to buy the asset at an even higher price. Peter Schiff again. The reason you claim Bitcoin as property is that it's useless as a currency. It has no intrinsic value. Opinion piece. Gotta love opinion pieces. Lacking any intrinsic value. Bitcoin's price could be anything or nothing at all. Yeah. Bitcoin News, quoting somebody there, Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. Bitcoin is highly volatile and has no intrinsic value. Peter Schiff again. Bitcoin is neither a safe haven, a store of value, nor an inflation hedge. That's just the bullshit used to promote Bitcoin. It's merely a highly speculative digital token with no intrinsic value. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. You know what? I agree. But maybe it's because we don't understand what those words mean. What is intrinsic value? There's actually 3 definitions for intrinsic value, and that's kind of a problem because you're talking to people and you use the term, maybe. Personally, I hate the term. I don't use it, and I'm going to explain why. But there are 3 different definitions. So maybe you're thinking one and another person is thinking another. The first definition of intrinsic value that you come across is the investment style definition. And this is something you'll find on websites like Investopedia. A measure of what an asset is worth that is arrived at by means of an objective calculation or complex financial model, or the what is intrinsic value description there. It's a measure of what an asset is worth. The measure is arrived at by objective calculation or complex financial model. Intrinsic value is different from the current market price of an asset. However, comparing it to the current price can give investors an idea of whether the asset is undervalued or overvalued. Financial analysis uses cash flow to determine the intrinsic or underlying value of a company or a stock. In options pricing, it's the difference between the strike price of the option and the current market price of the underlying asset. Okay, what is all of that? Bitcoin isn't a stock. You can't value it in the same kind of way. It doesn't have underlying cash flow, and all models are wrong. We know that. All models are wrong. Some models are useful, but in this case, no, it's not useful. You've got a model, complex model they described for having intrinsic value. How can something be intrinsic value if it's just this model that you came up with and you did a bunch of calculations and you said, this is the intrinsic value of that thing? It's meaningless. So honestly, that's a bullshit definition of intrinsic value. Nobody should use that. What other definitions? Well, here's a really common one. And this is something you'll find people arguing a lot on Twitter. They'll say that the intrinsic value of a thing is the value that thing would have separate to its use as money. For example, gold's intrinsic value comes from its use in jewelry and electronics. You can use gold in electronics. So clearly it has some kind of intrinsic value separate to its value as money. But money is just a use case of a thing. If I've got gold, I can use it in electronics. I can use it as a store of value. I can use it as a medium of exchange. And maybe it's good at some of these things, maybe it's bad at some of these things. Doesn't matter. Money is just another use case of a thing. So why would we say that something has a definition of intrinsic value being a use case other than money? Why have this weird exception there? It'd be like saying, the whatever we call it, value of gold is its use case outside of its use case in electronics. It's a bullshit definition. And besides, there is actually uses of Bitcoin outside of money. Bitcoin can be used as a timestamping system. Open timestamps is a system whereby you can write something into the chain and then prove that it happened at a particular time. Is that a great use case? I don't know. It's a use case, and it's not money. So Bitcoin does have uses outside of money. So really, this is another bullshit definition. Let's take a step back and instead look at the words. What does intrinsic mean? Intrinsic is belonging to a thing by its very nature. So you can say, for example, it's intrinsic that humans need to breathe if they want to not die. It's an intrinsic property of humans that we are breathing things. I think that's fairly non-controversial. So intrinsic is something which is inherent to the thing itself. And what's value? Well, value has a bunch of different definitions. There's actually way more. If you Google definition of value, you'll find huge amounts of different things. So the definition of value really comes down to a question of the subjective desire for a thing. So it can be something like the amount of money or goods and services that's considered to be a fair equivalent for something else. It can be an ideal accepted by some individual or group. Highly regard, think much of, hold dear, synonyms for value as a verb. So what does it mean to value something? Really, it means you want to have it. What is the value of something? It's the intersubjective belief between two people, how much they personally value that thing. So an exchange of some money for a thing is pretty much because I value that thing, you value that money, so I give you the money, you give me the thing, and we're happy. That's value. So in this, if something is intrinsic to a thing, it's inherently an objective fact about that thing. But if we value something, it's inherently a subjective assessment of a thing. So the description of intrinsic value, from the words, it's an oxymoron. It's bullshit. There are no sensible definitions of intrinsic value. Every single definition you will find has problems with it. They are all bullshit definitions because intrinsic value doesn't make sense. So if intrinsic value doesn't make sense, what should we be talking about? If all the definitions are bullshit, what now? Intrinsic properties of a thing can define an extrinsic value for that thing. For example, gold. Why does somebody value gold? Because they can use it in electronics, or because it makes nice jewelry, or because it's relatively scarce and you can hold on to it for a long time and then trade it with somebody else because you're expecting that they will want it as well. In other words, a store of value. So things have properties that we can value. So instead of talking about intrinsic value, instead we can talk about intrinsic properties of things. What properties does gold have that people value? It's verifiable, it's relatively scarce, it's malleable, you can shape it into nice stuff, it's fungible. A bar of gold is pretty much the same as another bar of gold. You really can't tell the difference between them unless they've got a stamp on them or something, but in general, an atom of gold is the same as any other atom of gold. And it's conductive, so you can use it in electronics. Gold has these properties, and it makes gold a fairly valuable thing. What properties does Bitcoin have that people value? Bitcoin is verifiable. You can verify Bitcoin on-chain very safely, very securely, very assuredly. Bitcoin is scarce. There's an exact amount, and we know the formula for how much there is going to be at any given time tradable in the world. Bitcoin is extremely portable, something that gold really isn't. I can walk across national borders or fly across national borders with some seed words in my head, which is access to Bitcoin. I can transfer huge amounts on seed words stored on a hardware device. You can take Bitcoin from one place to another really easily. So Bitcoin is very portable. Bitcoin is fungible, meaning one sat is the same as any other sat. There are certain people who are into things like ordinals who are going to disagree with that. That is just another layer on top. That's building something to pretend that Bitcoin isn't fungible, but it absolutely is. You can pretend that one atom of gold is different to another by looking at the history of that atom of gold, but if you don't know its history, it's the same atom of gold. Same thing with Bitcoin. One sat is the same as any other sat. And in fact, just to go into a little bit of the technical stuff, most people think that if I send you some Bitcoin, what I've actually done is sent some Bitcoin that I had. That's actually not true. Every time you make a Bitcoin transaction, you actually destroy all of the Bitcoin that existed in that you had, and you create new Bitcoin, which is exactly the same, new fungible Bitcoin, because you destroy an old UTXO, an unspent transaction output, and you create new UTXOs. So really, Bitcoin isn't transferred between people. Simply the ability to access Bitcoin is transferred, and the new UTXOs are new things. Bitcoin is programmable, something that gold most definitely isn't. I have 2 children. They are aged 13 and 10. And when my 10-year-old was born, so 10 years ago, I created a Bitcoin transaction output with a time lock on it, so that when my kids turn 16, they get access to their long-term cold storage. I can't even access it before then. It has a time lock. So I gave my kids Bitcoin in the future. Nobody can access it, nobody can steal it, nobody can take it. You couldn't force it out of me because I can't access it. So, programmable money. Bitcoin has these properties. Quite often you'll see something that looks like this. This one I took from Vijay Boyapati. It's a fairly common chart. You'll see lots of variants of this. But this is the different common properties that Bitcoin has as money. So monetary properties compared to other kinds of properties. Like I said, gold is malleable, so you can make nice jewelry. Gold is conductive, so you can make electronics out of it. Those are properties, but they're not really monetary properties. So comparing the monetary properties of different kinds of money, Bitcoin versus gold versus fiat, Bitcoin essentially wins in every regard, except, of course, established history. Bitcoin is younger than most other currencies, but that's just a matter of time. There's no technical reason to say that that would be an issue. So that makes Bitcoin better, objectively, at being money than any other form. If you can show me a better form of money, I will stop using Bitcoin and I will use that instead. But I don't believe you can. So how much we care about these properties defines how valuable it is. If I were dying of thirst in a desert, I would love to have a bottle of water. In fact, even standing up here, it's relatively warm, I'm talking a lot. I probably value a bottle of water right now slightly more than somebody who's just sitting there not talking, because, I'm getting a little bit thirsty. Thank you very much. Excellent. So, how much we care about these properties define how valuable they are. This bottle of water is more valuable to me than it was to Rachel sitting down there. Thank you very much. But that also means that the properties of the water are the things that I care about. It quenches my thirst. It makes me less thirsty. And I care about that more than I would have cared about the amount of money I might have spent buying a bottle of water after this talk. Now I don't need to, thank you. Jump back a slide to those properties. How much do I care about my money being durable? How much do I care about my money being portable, fungible, verifiable, divisible, scarce, having an established history, and being censorship resistant? I will place different values on those things than somebody else might. In fact, some people may say, I will not use money which doesn't have a ridiculously long established history. Personally, I say I do not care about the established history of a money. I care about the other properties much more. I care that it's scarce, because scarce money can't be unnecessarily inflated. Of course, you can have things built around it. You can have paper Bitcoin, so Bitcoin stored on exchanges, and the exchange pretends to have Bitcoin that they actually don't. So there are properties that, but that's not a property of Bitcoin, that's a property of this imaginary thing built around it. How divisible is my money? I care a lot about that. How verifiable? I care very much about that. So the properties that I care about are the ones that Bitcoin beats other types of money in. Therefore, I'm a Bitcoiner. If you care about these properties as well, you should be a Bitcoiner. That's, I think, most of the people in this room probably are. So how much we care about the properties define how valuable a particular thing is. So yeah, Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. That's a fact. But Bitcoin has intrinsic properties that make it extremely valuable in the world that we live in. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I wonder if we're running a little ahead of time, so I see Alan is he's getting mic'd up right now, so we'll just give him. Yes, please, Rachel. Please ask a question. Wait a second. What made you pick 16 for your time lock for your child for the recording?
Actually, nothing in particular other than the fact that in the culture that I grew up in, 16 is generally considered an adult, so I simply aimed for 16.
No.
My mother left home when she was 16. I left home when I was 16. So as soon as my kids are 16, out they go. No, I'm kidding. But no, chances are when that time lock expires, I'm not just going to give it straight to my kids. I'm going to continue to custody it myself, but I have the keys. But at that point, I have the ability to give it to my kids. Yeah.
Were there any other questions, before? Yes, Rado. Yep.
Correct. Yes, the US dollar does not have intrinsic value either. I would argue nothing has intrinsic value. So sure, Bitcoin doesn't have intrinsic value, but nothing has intrinsic value because the definition of intrinsic value is ridiculous. Like I said, out of those three definitions, one of them was really a financial thing based on weird calculations. Another was some random thing that people came up with on the internet about its monetary use case being separate to other use cases. Why? It makes no sense. And the third version, it's an oxymoron. You've got a objective and a subjective thing coming together. It's ridiculous to say that anything has intrinsic value. They have intrinsic properties that we value.
One more question, yes? Is it difficult to put a time lock on your Bitcoin?
Yeah, is it technically difficult? Back when I did it, yes, you kind of had to do it manually, but I believe there's plenty of tools out there for doing it now. Things have progressed a lot in the last 10 or so years.
All right, Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.